I wonder what it means that summer, the season of lightheartedness and ease and informality, begins and ends with somber and serious holidays. We don't treat them that way, but the reality is that Labor Day should make us think about the working person and honor work. And of course, Memorial Day should be that day in which we consciously regard those who have perished, especially in war, with a special regard. I think when it comes to Memorial Day, pausing right now before firing up the grill and running off to the beach is not unlike having to say grace before Thanksgiving dinner. So much is there in front of us. We want to get to it right away, but Mom and Dad say, no, before we go and enjoy the food, let's be grateful. And that's what Memorial Day is, a moment of gratitude that the gifts we have were often purchased with the lives of others. And of course, when we say that grace at the beginning of the meal in November, we remember, not just say the words, we remember the people. And you know, in the end, that makes the meal better because we remember eating it with others. And I hope that Memorial Day causes you to remember someone dear to you when you're having fun, that they come and visit you not only when you're sad, but when you're happy. And so this solemn pause, I think, actually makes the day better. At least it could. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my Redeemer. Now, 6 months from now, you notice I'm already thinking of November, there will be a special occasion, at least to me, when we will pause to remember, in fact, a remembrance, not an event, but the remembrance of an event, a memorial so profound that 150 years later, the memorial is more remembered than what it commemorated. I speak of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which took place in November of 1863, and the 150th anniversary will be here this November. A fabulous and wonderful book by Gary Wills called Lincoln at Gettysburg truly affected me when it was written 20 years ago. Contrary to his words, we remember what he said more than what they did. And one reason, I think, is that he spoke a kind of truth that we all know but rarely say. But in a larger sense, he said, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. And if you recall the passage from Whitman earlier, it was that experience that came to Whitman's mind as he was venerating Ralph Waldo Emerson in a simple little grave there in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery up in Concord, Massachusetts. He reflected back on that moment and thought of how Lincoln's words were appropriate because, as he put it, Whitman, and this is the text that motivates me this morning. He wrote, Whitman did, "It is not we who come to consecrate the dead. We reverently come to receive some consecration." I think that's a telling experience and thought because we think we're doing them a favor, but I think it's the other way around. Who blesses whom? We think that we're the ones with our rituals, that we bless the dead. After all, it's we who go to the cemeteries and the churches, who come to services, who write and read the obituaries, who assemble the photo montages, who buy the flowers and follow all the unwritten but important rules of grief. Why would we do these things if it were not to bless them, to show honor? But by bless, we have to use the word very precisely. When I hear the word bless, I hear the ancient Hebrew word that lies behind it, barach, just like the president's name, which means to bless. but it comes from an older word that means to bend the knee, as in revere something more important than you, as in you go to see the king or the queen and you might curtsy or bow. We do that for the dead. We may not bow, of course, but we do things like that, or at least we did. I can remember my father pausing on the street to take off his hat when a hearse went by. Now they scurry down the highway and we try to get out of their way. I remember men wearing armbands of black, and women who wore veils, little netted veils, for at least a little while. These are gone now, at least in our country. And those habits, and the ones we still observe, are ways that we humble ourselves when someone has died. Now, you may have noticed, if you keep track, that I have conflated the word bless with the word consecrate. They do seem similar. They're both kind of ritual acts of solemn honor. But as I pondered these two thoughts, it occurred to me that they are not synonymous. They are mirror actions. They look similar, but they do different things. Blessing something or someone is to humble yourself before it. The way a Hindu would greet you and say namaste, or if you're in Japan, they would bow. That's to bless. When the Buddhist community came here to observe the Buddha's birthday last year, they literally prostrated themselves on the floor, just like Muslims when they worship. Blessing acknowledges something sacred. It is to revere. Consecration is what makes something sacred. Last week I talked about the ancient Israelite notion of the Nazirite, a person who dedicates him or herself to God. They become holy by their actions. More often, we think of a consecration as something like a church building when it's consecrated to divine service. And bishops in the Christian tradition are consecrated, not ordained. When Lincoln speaks of the dead as consecrating the cemetery in which they lie, in other words, their death itself makes them sacred. Whitman borrows that notion to speak of Emerson as having given sanctity to the land in which he lies, and and by association, those who approach the grave. As I think about it now, blessing and consecrating are not only mirrors, they're kind of reciprocal. At a memorial service or a graveside, during a commemoration like this, we can feel the dead close and feel a little more sacredness in the room. They make us more sacred by being present. And in return for that, we bow, we bend, we're grateful. Or, more accurately, we used to be. Though some of those old rituals remain, death and grief have changed, at least in the years I have been watching. Ritual formality has retreated while personal informality has advanced, and for good reason. Formality and ritual are ultimately impersonal things. And at the time of death, the person who died is the person we want to see, to feel, to touch. Is it not awful enough that the world has moved on and forgotten so quickly? Do we have to forget them even in the memorial service? And so memorial services now truly are times to bring the whole person in. Photographs, sometimes music, sometimes even recordings. Who was not moved by that wonderful poem by Auden? Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. We've all felt that way. Stop, world, I've just lost someone dear to me. Do not move on until I have held on to the last of them. We don't want the world to move on. We want to keep the person here. That's our struggle. We want to keep our dead, and yet we must let them go. We want the world to remember them, and yet they must forget. And that's why we have cemeteries and services and observances. I'd like to talk a little about cemeteries for a minute or two. We don't always go there, and I think that's a loss. 35 years ago, I was a student minister in Massachusetts, and I always had a day off. My boss insisted I stay away from church one day a week. I had a car. I was in Massachusetts. I loved history, so I went from town to town looking at all these ancient colonial things. And every town had a burial ground, and not one off on the side, often right in the middle of the town, because in ancient times you didn't want to go dragging coffins all over. You brought them right downtown. It was an important thing. I was in the town of Hingham, Massachusetts. It's south of Boston. It has a very old meeting house, the oldest in North America. It's a beautiful thing. And next door is part of the burial ground. Puritans didn't use conventional things. They called them what they were, burial grounds. And there are those slabs of slate with those wonderful carvings, but it was on a hill. And the hill, therefore, was sometimes hollowed out for a vault for the wealthy, where they could park themselves and their family. And they'd have doors on them, often metal doors, and some of them were quite rusty. And so I walked up to one, and one of the doors was open. Who could not look in an open door? I bent down very low and looked inside, and the skull looked back at me, as real as me. I wasn't scared, but I was startled. I wasn't expecting it, obviously. But what it told me was, well, in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire and in New England, often a gravestone had this carved on it, and I had the experience described right there. There's a little doggerel poem that reads, "Remember me as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare for death and follow me." Seeing that skull made that poem very, very real. And just as suddenly, the past was not a book or a story or a class in school. It became very, very real.